Hello. Welcome to our briefing, the industrial strategy, thinking through local responses. This is the final of our spring series of breakfast briefings. These are short 45-minute long sessions to help busy policymakers better understand evidence on economic growth. I'm Megan Streb. I'm head of outreach at the Wartwork Center for Local Economic Growth. We help to make local growth policy more cost-effective through better use of evidence and evaluation. Today's session is going to be a slightly different format. We're going to have a discussion around the industrial strategy. As always, it will be followed by a Q&A, so please do submit questions throughout, and we will come to those towards the end of the session. But at this time, I'd like to welcome our director, Henry Overman, and Paul Swinney, Director of Policy and Research at Center for Cities, to join me. Right. Thank you both. So let's start by discussing the aims of the industrial strategy. What should the industrial strategy be trying to accomplish?
Is that for me, Megan?
Yes, please.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming along. For me, it's very much about productivity growth. Now, why do I say that? Well, if you look at what the government has communicated so far externally, they've talked about things around being the fastest growing country within the G7 over a sustainable growth, I think they say, across the G7. But they don't really define what they mean by growth, and they don't really define what they mean in terms of time period either, which gives you a lot of flexibility or ambiguity about what it is maybe we're trying to aim for. The reason why productivity growth is so important is because it's productivity that drives long-run standards of living. It's what ultimately puts money in people's pockets. It is what makes us better off. And the big challenge for the UK is not about growth in output over a 1-year period or a 2-year period relative to other G7 countries, but it's actually the gap that we see in terms of productivity between ourselves and certainly France and Germany in particular. And that gap is about 13%. Now, that's a pretty big difference in living standards. Being 13% more productive leads to people being quite comfortably better off, I think, in those countries than what is the case here. So the challenge, therefore, then, is to close this productivity gap. And so it's focusing on that. It's been specific that it is about productivity. And I think we'd go even further, and I think we can measure that. We can be a bit more targeted about what we're aiming to do. So for us, it will be about trying to close that prosperity gap between France and Germany. So that 13% gap, we're trying to close it rather than just we're going to be more productive in 10 years' time. It is the goal of this is to close that, because there's no reason why the UK should be any less productive than France, any less productive than Germany. Now, I think internally the government recognise that. I think implicitly in the industrial strategy green paper, they recognise that. But then also there's also this confusing comms around fastest growing country, what type of growth in the G7 over what period, what are we actually trying to aim for? And I don't think that is helpful then for other public bodies who are trying to fall in behind the industrial strategy. And then particularly for local growth plans and colleagues who are working on that, I think it especially is not clear. So the industrial strategy should focus on productivity growth, and the local growth plan should feed into that by focusing on productivity growth as well. And then everything else follows on from that.
Okay, I think that's really useful to set it out in terms of it is a big picture strategy, right? It's about productivity and it's a national strategy. Henry, do you have anything to add in terms of what the industrial strategy should be looking to do?
Yeah, let me just react quickly. I should add, I have to say the following caveat right up front. I'm on the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council, and everything that I'm going to say on this is my personal view, not the view of the council or of the government. I agree with Paul. I think that the number one focus needs to be on productivity. I also think that it's important that the messaging is really clear. And I think that message is slowly clarifying as the government works on it more. The one thing I would say is that we need to be clear on what we really mean by productivity. So, I think that a lot of the focus needs to be on the amount that we're producing per job. But, I think there also rightly sometimes might be a focus in taking people who are doing nothing and getting them into some kind of employment, right? So there's two ways to grow the overall size of the economy per person. One is to increase productivity, and I agree with Paul that that should be the number one focus. But actually, there is something about moving people from an activity into work, or from unemployment into work. And I think that there will be a secondary objective that is around that. Don't think you should dilute the core message, but I think it needs to be there.
Okay. So I mean that's interesting, starting to think about the labor market as well. So are sectors the right framing for the industrial strategy? Paul, do you want to start?
So I don't think particularly. There's definitely a wide range of views on this, and I'm at the one end of the spectrum. So let me break that down as to why that's the case. So I do think there should be some sectoral focus. The industrial strategy, and it sort of relates back to what Henry was saying about employment there. The industrial strategy, if it's focused on productivity, should be focused on those sectors that are, or those parts of the economy that are most likely to see large gains in productivity in the next 10, 15, 20 years. Now, we know from theory and from history that that isn't non-tradable activities, or local services as we call them, or the everyday economy as the Chancellor once called them. So jobs in cafes and bars and social care and things like that. They're important parts of the economy from an employment perspective, but they're not going to deliver large productivity gains. You know, it's going to be those cutting edge sectors at the frontier of the economy that are most likely going to see productivity growth in the future if we are going to achieve the target that we want to achieve. So we do need to focus down and recognise this is not something that applies to the whole economy. It applies to a part of the economy. So that filtering is helpful. And then again, in the Green Paper, they do that. They talk about, you know, high productivity sectors that also have higher probability, we think, to see growth in the future. So you agreed with that to some extent. I think then things start to get a bit tricky, because what politicians like to do, and certainly there'll be a big desire to do this in local growth plans, if they're anything like the ones we've written in the past, is that then we sort of get overconfident and say, all right, well, actually, we're going to pick out individual sectors, and we're going to be leaders in fintech and edtech and something else. So maybe, but our track record of picking this out in the past has been pretty poor. I think the biggest challenge of all this is that the growth sectors of tomorrow might not even exist today. So it's literally impossible to pick out what those sectors would be. So I think from that point, I think once we filter down to thinking about the sort of the frontier of the economy, I'm then a bit nervous about how much deeper we go. And I think it's right to have that focus on that broad group, but it's then thinking about the conditions that are required to attract and grow those sectors of the future in whatever exact activity there might be, rather than this over-specific and frankly unnecessary selection of particular sectors, where I think it just then starts to distract away from actually some of the more core challenges as to why we might not have as much of this activity as maybe what we would like, and why we need an industrial strategy in the first place.
It's an interesting one. I wonder if there's a distinction between a national focus on specific industrial sectors versus a local one. That's me musing. Henry, do you want to? Paul's desperate to come back in.
So Paul, quick.
So to some extent, yes. I'm a little bit more softer about why you might have a sectoral approach at the national level, in that there may be some levers to pull, like subsidies, like regulation, for example, which would apply to some specific sectors. So I can sort of see that to some extent. At the local level, I really don't think there are levers that you can pull around particular industries. I think if those levers exist, they're at the national level, not the local level, which then gets on, what should the local plans focus on, which I think we might come back to a little bit later.
Yeah, so let me just add quickly on the sector stuff. I mean, again, the sort of my view has changed slightly since being involved at thinking about this over the last few months, really a lot. So I think Paul's absolutely right. The real danger here is that you're too confident about the sectors that you are going to grow in, right? So I think there needs to be lots of careful analysis about, where our strengths really are, and identifying the barriers. Now, once you've done that, which I think they are, the government is really trying to do, then I actually think there is some sense in sort of saying, all right, we know we're really strong in these sectors. We know that these advantages tend to persist over long periods of time, right? We've been good at financial services for a long time. You know, we've got a really strong cultural industry. We've got good life sciences and pharma. And I think there is value in saying, all right, let's look at those sectors and ask ourselves if there's barriers to the growth in that. Now, where I'd slightly nuance relative to Paul is I do agree that most of that is national, but not all of it. Sometimes you've got to do specific things in specific places. And I think that thinking about what specific things need to happen in specific places to really shift the dial on some national stuff is going to be important. So for financial services, what are we going to do about housing in London or commercial development in London? You could ask similar questions, say, around the life sciences and the labs in Cambridge. I think the danger for local places, in addition to just predicting this wrong, is that they then start to think, oh, we've got to have something to say in those core sectors, even if it's like miles from anything that might be reasonably going on in the local economy. And I think that's probably a good moment to start pivoting more towards the local, which I know is what many people will on the call will be interested in. But that's one of my big worries about the sectoral focus distorting what happens at the local level for places which don't really necessarily have strengths.
So my next question is about how we bring sector and place together. And I guess maybe we need to disentangle that and talk first about how do we bring sector and place together at a national strategy level. And then we can talk about sector and place and how it fits in with the local level.
Yeah, well, if we look at the distribution of many of the areas the government is wanting to see growth in, but what we would describe as being sort of the cutting edge of the economy, that sort of nascent part of the economy where most likely be using new innovations to push the economy on, they are disproportionately located in certain places, and they show a particular preference for cities, but city centres in particular. Now, when we then look at and this gets us back to the sector point, when we look at the makeup of that cutting edge, so fintech or AI or Internet of Things or net zero or whatever it might be, what we see is that there's a huge amount of co-location going on within that as well. And so for me, or for Centre for Cities, what that suggests to us is that it's not as if you get one bit of sector here and one bit of sector there and it sort of spreads evenly across the country. These different mixes of activities are concentrating in the same places because they're looking for the same fundamental things. Now, that is most likely to be access to a deep pool of skilled workers, access to appropriate commercial space, and access to other sort of knowledge-based cutting-edge type companies where you can share ideas and information with. And that's why sort of city centres in particular, I think, are attractive to this type of activity. So the key challenge then for government then is not necessarily, notwithstanding some national things that you might do, say, around regulation, is not then what's going to be the sector plan for sector X, but it is actually, have we got places in the country that are able to attract and sustain the growth of this type of activity? And in particular, have we got large cities that are able to attract and sustain this type of activity when this industry comes into existence? Because it might not currently, but when it does, we can probably make a fairly good assumption that it won't just be city-based, but it will be disproportionately city-based. Certainly enough, the past is anything to go by, and our assumptions about become ever more knowledge-based and the value of proximity being important hold. So on that basis, it then takes you into what often gets described as being wider drivers in terms of the interventions. But it also means it helps to bring that place and sector bit together, which I think the government wants to do, but I think is struggling probably a little bit to bring these two things together. And the way I'd articulate it is that if, Minister, you want these sectors, we know that these sectors preferably have a preference for these types of places. If we get the place bit right, then you'll get the growth in the sectors that you want to have the growth in. And that's the way I would tie those things together.
Henry, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I think again, I think I broadly agree with what Paul's saying. I think I would reiterate the point I made about specific things in specific places. I do think some of that will be outside of the places that Centre for Cities has been emphasising. And actually, I've emphasised a lot, throughout the research, etc., that I've done, because I think, so take, for example, the industries that are crucial for the transition to net zero, I think the evidence is quite clear that some of the places where we've got strengths in those activities will sit outside of the cities that Paul was talking about, which cover lots of these sectors. So I actually think that you'll need at least two sort of blocks of activities, one of which is, all right, so we know that somewhere is particularly important for this sector. What are we going to do about that? Then where I think I do agree with Paul very strongly is, there will be some places, and maybe we can get on to where we think they might be, that have strength across 5, 6 of the core activities that we're talking about. And, then there is clearly, this is reinforcing some of the arguments that you would get if you were doing this in a sector neutral way, right? That, well, looking at sectors says, well, okay, you've got 6 or 7 of the sort of sectors are strong in particular places, and then coming from a place sort of perspective, you've got sort of strength in that, and I think those two things are going to align to reinforce one another. So I think it's a funny tension, right? So I think some of the sectoral stuff is going to reinforce the case that has been traditionally made about places, and then just pushing against that a little bit is going to be these specific things in specific places, which aren't necessarily going to be in those cities, etc., that we've been talking about for 15, 20 years.
Yeah, Meg, I'll come back to that as well, because I think that's an interesting distinction within that. I think there is, so if we were to say net zero, and you said net zero, and carbon capture and storage in particular, that probably is, to some extent, is less driven by access to knowledge, certainly carbon capture, and will be more driven by topographical, easy for me to say, and geological features of a place, which is a different driver. That's then down to the location of a place, literally the physical geography of it. So I think there probably is a distinction there within that of noting within our key sectors. Are we talking about the knowledge element, or is there something else that's driving their location? And I think that then reinforces Henry's point about how we might think about these different things. So I principally think about the knowledge bit, but I accept that there's then some of that other stuff that is going on too, which might then lead to a distortion. Having said that, I think the interesting thing about this is, even if you look at wind turbine production in the UK, my understanding is that the turbines themselves are built in Hull, and so having facilities available for that to happen, planning in particular, I think it'll be important for that. But the knowledge element of that, the design of them, I think happens in Siemens' location in Manchester city centre. So you are still then getting that difference in split in activities. The other thing I'd just add is that broadly what Henry was saying is that in some ways you could start from both places and get to the same answer. I think that is definitely possible, and maybe I should be more relaxed about that because of that. The one thing I guess for colleagues to be wary of is that if you start through the sector lens, you then start looking for specific things that affect that exact sector. So I'm going to write a sector plan for life sciences. I hope will do this, but probably won't do this. It probably won't say we need to build more houses. It'll probably say something about IP and regulation and things like that. And it's just the element of whether the sector stuff then makes us too blind to the fact that actually intervention around life sciences is housing in Cambridge, which is also the intervention we'd make for AI in Cambridge, which is also the intervention we'd make for Internet of Things in Cambridge. So it's just how people then perceive that, I think, is my concern, or how it might limit their policy response.
Okay, so other than places understanding their geology and topography, I want to also think about other things that we want, that we think should be part of that local responses for this session. So specifically for combined authorities and emerging combined authorities, how should they complement or incorporate the industrial strategy within their local growth plans?
So first off, I think the national strategy, like I said earlier, needs to have a very clear aim about what it is trying to achieve. And then I think everything falls out underneath that, including local growth plans, where there's a very clear steer about what it is that they're trying to do. Within that, though, I think the local growth plans need to recognise the different roles that different parts of the country inherently should be playing in the national economy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that Manchester city centre, notwithstanding some of the things we're talking about other parts of the economy, but Manchester city centre is going to play an outsized role, not just in the Greater Manchester area, not just in the northwest area, but actually in the national economy. And so it's good. So therefore, sort of how we think about Manchester city centre should be different to how we think about some of the outlying suburbs from an economy perspective. The same goes for the northeast. You know, Newcastle city centre in particular should be playing a different role to deep rural Northumberland. So it's understanding those different elements about that. And indeed, if we were then expending local growth plans to mayorities that didn't cover big cities, of which it's a bit ambiguous as to whether actually those other places will be invited to do so or not, they should be trying to improve their economies. They should be trying to increase the productivity of their economies. But they also need to recognise that the potential they've got, the headroom that they've got to see that those productivity improvements in a deep-lying rural area is probably much smaller than the headroom that an underperforming large city has. You know, underperforming large city should be leading the national economy, as happens in other developed countries. Deeper lying, perhaps more smaller urban or more rural type areas are probably not going to play as big a role, which then shapes what it is that you think you might be able to achieve, and also then shapes the resource that is put behind it, as well as where you target that resource within the combined authority.
Yeah, I'd like us to come back to kind of the places outside of cities in a minute. Henry, anything else on MCAs that you think they should be considering?
Yeah, so let me add a few thoughts here. At least for me, I don't think it's totally clear yet how the local growth plans are going to sit alongside the industrial strategy. I think that is a bit of a work in progress. So I think that it's, for people in the MCAs, I think it's really important they try to engage in that debate about how they're thinking about local growth plans and the interaction with them with the industrial strategy. So I actually think there's a role here for MCA colleagues to be actually helping central government think about this. I mean, Paul and I have had a long tradition of thinking, there's a lot of expertise outside of central government which could be useful. So actually, I do think there's a role for MCAs. I think that how it plays out will differ a lot depending on where you are. I mean, Paul sort of hinted at that. So I could see, for example, for some MCAs, it could be reinforcing the cases that they might make. Let me try and think of an example. All right, so let's take GM, right? Here's a good example. So national government says, we really want to be strong in media, culture media, right, and digital. Manchester gets the BBC. Salford is creating the sort of conditions for growth in that sector. Let's imagine that we were then revisiting the relocation of Channel 4. I mean, let me take an example that's gone, but let's imagine that we were revisiting that, and you really had an industrial strategy in place that says we want to drive, this is really important to national growth. You could see that might strengthen Manchester's case that Channel 4 should also go to Manchester to reinforce its overall contribution to the national economy. Now, I don't know if there's anyone from Leeds, they'll massively jump on that comment. I'm just saying that you can see that there will be, for some places, taking a sectoral lens might strengthen their strategy. The other crucial thing I wanted to say here, though, which is very much to reiterate Paul's point, is I would see the sectoral thing as a complement, but I think it's second order relative to the horizontal strategy, the horizontal stuff that Paul was talking about. So I really think that LGPs should, for all MCAs, should be focusing on getting the core conditions right, cutting across sectors. And then I think there will be a bit of that they want to complement that talks of the industrial strategy of the government, being wary of the fact that who knows where we'll be in 4 or 5 years' time, who knows whether we picked exactly the right sectors, etc. So I think it's something that they have to consider, that may reinforce some arguments, they may weaken others, but I think it's crucially important that it doesn't distract from the absolutely core focus on making sure the horizontals are good across lots and lots of different sectors.
Okay. So we only have a couple minutes before we then move on to questions, and it's great that I've already seen quite a few questions, which is fantastic. So just to kind of finish off on, I mean, this might be different in a year or two's time, but at the moment, there's still a lot of the country that isn't within a devolution area. How should other local authorities respond to the industrial strategy? I mean, Paul, you kind of touched on that a bit already, but any other advice you want to give for local authority folks who are on this call?
Well, I'm sure there are places. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've heard of places who haven't been invited to write local growth plans, explicitly writing one. That is understandable. If the national government is setting an overall strategy, I think you want to be in a place to be able to respond and have a conversation with national government. And even if you're not writing a local growth plan, there will be a plan of some essence, or some nature that places have been writing for decades now. And so it's no surprise at some point in the future, there will be another one of these written in your area, even if it isn't a local growth plan. I think the basic things that we've set out here, I think, apply to both places that have got a local growth plan or currently writing one and those who haven't been invited. Thinking about those things, how do you focus on productivity, and then understanding the role that you play in the national economy, and then your capability, I think, to boost productivity. I think the things to be thinking about. Now, most areas where that are currently underperforming, there's a better version of themselves that exists, and interventions should be there to try and make that place a better version of itself. But I think it is also noting that if you are the risk of offending places, if you are a deep-lying rural area like mid Wales, for example, you're not, or you shouldn't be, as productive as the centre of Manchester. If you are as productive as the centre of Manchester, the national economy has got a big problem to try and sort out. So it's understanding that, rather than, I think, then piling into, we're going to be the growth centre for X, Y, and Z, and we need to have an AI growth zone and these types of things. Like, well, how realistic is that, given the inherent benefits or otherwise that your place offers to cutting edge type activities? The second thing probably to say on that as well is that you often get criticism about, if you look at all these plans, all you need to do is just rub out the name of one place and write in the other place, and it's exactly the same. To some degree, I think we should be relaxed about that. So Birmingham and Manchester are big cities that both underperform. They both should be these crucibles of innovation, crucibles of cutting edge activity. That they're not is probably driven by fairly similar challenges, and so the response should be set fairly similar. Where plans should differ, again, is that the plan for, I don't know, if we were to write one for Cornwall or for rural Wales, for example, those plans should be different from Manchester. Together, they might look quite similar in terms of the two more rural areas, but should look very different to the city one. So again, that's where the role of the place becomes important then, because it really tailors what the policy response should look like and what expectations should look like as well.
Great. Henry, anything else?
Yeah, I think just to repeat one message, I think for some local areas, there will be these specific things in specific places. And there, I think it'll be really important that they try to engage with, their ability to deliver that. I think the other thing I'd say is I think there's a really tricky thing here, because I think it's quite understandable that local places will sort of do their analysis and come up with some local priorities. I think the big risk, a big tension, is that the industrial sector skews the analysis that they do, that they come up with stuff that is now important to them locally because it's in the industrial strategy, and it's never gonna shift the dial nationally. And that's going to be it will be difficult to get sort of national government to engage with things that sort of are important that we're claimed to be important locally, but just don't feel important nationally. So I think there's a really interesting tension there. I think, though, it comes back to Paul's message. I really would be careful about distorting the analysis very much, right? I think if you distort the analysis, say, oh, we're really good in X because X is in the industrial strategy. Remember, sitting on the other side of this is a central government analyst that's saying, are you really good in X? And even if you're really good in X, are you really important to X nationally? So I think it's important to remember that there's someone sitting on the other side that's asking those questions about the analysis that places are doing locally, and not to allow it to skew local priorities too much. But look, I'm going to stop there because I see we've got loads of questions and I want to try and get to them.
We do have loads. I'm actually going to start with some of the more recent ones. So there's one about rural areas and coastal communities. And I think we've already touched on this a bit in terms of, but just any, and then there's another one about kind of smaller cities. So I'm wondering if maybe, I don't know how easily we can tackle those two together. But thoughts on how to make sure they don't feel left out, and what they should be doing in a space that is trying to set up conditions for changing that productivity gap.
Yeah, the phrase left out, I think, is a really interesting one, Megan, because if we get into the realms, I think, of perceiving everywhere being the same and everywhere's got to get something, that's not a good outcome for economic policy. I think we do have to recognise that different places play different roles, and we should be expecting a lot more out of Birmingham or a lot more out of Manchester than how much we're expecting to get out of Wakefield, let's say, or Penrith, to go much smaller, or Grimsby, for example. And policy needs to reflect that. And I think we get in the realms of, oh, we've just got to do something everywhere. Then you end up not really achieving anything because you're not sort of focused on the stuff where that Henry was talking about, which is the stuff that's going to nationally shift the dial. Now, that isn't to say we shouldn't be doing anything in those areas, but the ability that that policy has got to bring about economic change in those areas is just much more limited than what it is in some of those larger places, because of the inherent things that those cutting edge knowledge based companies are looking for. You can't just invent these things in rural areas that all of a sudden you can be in Penrith and then have access to an enormous labour market and a dense network of other knowledge based businesses and access loads of beautiful countryside, but you don't access those, can't offer those benefits that those high skilled companies are looking for. So it's trying to tailor that and understand what that looks like. You can create a plan around that, but you have to be careful, I think, about what it is that you expect to be able to do. I think even, if we look at Humberside, even within that, probably the chances of doing some stuff or policy making a difference in Hull, economic policy making a difference in Hull as a place of production, is probably got a better chance than doing so within Grimsby, which is just smaller again. And so it's not to say you can't make a difference on economic policy. Again, I think we can make other interventions that are public standards of living, public services, etc. But on economy, I think it's understanding that what is the power the state has got, and that power does vary across different parts of the country depending on how urban they are.
Can I add a couple of things super quick? So one of which is I would focus on identifying the things which lots of places like you are experiencing and really pushing on them, for the national policy leaders. Like what additional insight can we bring on inactivity? What additional insight can we bring on areas where the government is trying to make decisions that will affect everyone? Well, the other thing that I would add is that some of it might help sometimes thinking about a sectoral approach, but in the non-core sectors, and think about, like, what do we need to happen in social care? I mean, we know a lot of coastal communities, for example, are offering a lot of social care, right? So homes that look after older people, etc. I mean, there are things that could be changed there that will have some kind of economic impact. Look, they're not in the core sectors. So I actually think it's identifying the commonalities and pushing on those much more than the trying to make the sort of, I'm completely unique, I really need investment on X or Y, because I think that would be a really hard case.
Okay. So moving back to sectors, there was a question about whether having a focus on cities and creating that kind of as a hub for co-location ends up actually leading to an eventual decline. I'm not sure that I'm reading this right. Let me read it out. Does having preset and dedicated hubs for cities and places not have a threat leading to the decline of focused areas as city life gets linked to industrial performance?
Well, so no, so I think, I mean, like, I'm not totally sure, but I think there is an interesting trade-off there, right? Which comes as something that Paul and I have talked about, many times, which is, there is something about the amenity and the quality of life in cities that areas need to be thinking about. So, yes, I mean, and the really poisonous ones, I'm afraid, will be the ones where local places feel that the amenity and quality of life stuff really conflicts with the growth agenda. I mean, this is precisely why, for example, in these areas where we really think we need the commercial building, we need the housing, etc., you see these massive backlashes against the fact that, oh, we're concreting over the countryside. So actually, there'll need to be a set of really important conversations that happen around quality of life and amenity offer at local places. I think, my feeling, and I suspect Paul shares this, is just that we've got to offer strong enough incentives to local places that even if there is some effect on amenity or whatever, the fact that they're helping deliver on the national growth delivers enough local benefits that people are willing to, to go with the growth, with the policies that we want to shift growth at the national level. At the moment, part of the problem is that those benefits don't flow locally. So you have the new housing and the schools deteriorate and you can't get a GP appointment and we don't do all the public service delivery, etc. Or there's congestion and we don't invest enough in transport. So I think we've just got to be aware of the fact that once you get these growth things, you'll need to be talking back to what's going on in the growth plans on those.
I think there's another aspect of this, and I'm not sure if the question was getting at it or not, but some of the other questions I think are getting at it, so it's worth touching on too, is that just because production happens in very specific places, by production I mean the economy, I mean services as well as manufacturing, doesn't mean that those benefits only accrue to those very specific places, because glibly people commute. Now, we can see this around London very clearly in terms of the prosperity of towns and villages around London, how it spreads that prosperity out. But when we've done research looking at other cities as well, Manchester and Birmingham, yes, but also Newcastle, Nottingham, Sheffield, Liverpool, etc. too, that we see exactly the same mechanism occurring, where the city generates the prosperity, which then is then accessed by people who live in places around it. And just it's understanding that it's not, oh, well, let's go in Manchester city centre so everyone else is to hell in the handcart. Actually, having that prosperity there then brings benefit to the broader area. The real challenge we've got is the underperformance of many of the second tier cities like Manchester, Newcastle, Sheffield, etc. means that while they do spread prosperity, they don't generate enough prosperity to spread as much of it as what we would want. So then you get the idea of left behind smaller places around these big places, not because the big place is sucking everything in, but because the big place is not performing well enough to then generate that prosperity to spread around. So it's really important, again, that we think about the system we're looking at, the roles that different places play in the national economy, then the links between them, and how prosperity generated in one place is then accessed in another, which then brings you into housing and transport and skills policies within those places as well as in the bigger cities themselves.
Okay, let's go for, we have a couple minutes left. Let's go for a nice easy one. Will the UK industrial strategy need a rethink in the context of US protectionism?
Well, I'll try and say something sensible on that because it's not my area of expertise. I mean, first off, there's a question about the longevity of this. Does it last for the current presidency or does it go longer? I'm going to make the assumption that it lasts only as the length of the current presidency. That might be wrong, but let's assume that's the case. If it is the case, the industrial strategy is not about growth for the next 4 years. I mean, the Green Paper says invest 2035, so it's growth about the next 11 years at the very least. I think it's probably even longer than that as well. I don't think we're closing the gap with France and Germany that I said at the top even within the space of 11 years. So from a long-term perspective, I don't think it really affects it. I think there's some short-term volatility, but there are some long-term challenges that we're trying to deal with in the UK economy, which will certainly outlast President Trump's presidency. Whether it outlasts American thinking around tariffs that match with Trump's thinking, we don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, let me quickly add. I mean, it's predominantly tariffs at the moment. And that doesn't matter for many of the sectors that have been identified as core, right? So it's other areas of economic policy that will really matter. I mean, the biggest issue will be if, you know, if there's massive disruption to the American economy, you know, that will have global implications. But I mean, ultimately, they're an important trading partner for the UK, but the European Union is more important. I mean, that's the whole fallacy behind Brexit, right? You know, I mean, much bigger concern for me is the reset in our relations with the EU. That'd be far more, I really think that's the important thing, because I don't think the tariffs will hit on the service industry. I mean, then there's all kinds of stuff about migration, etc., but I think that's too far afield for today's audience.
Right. A quick one about displacement. And I guess, again, this might touch on the difference between a national industrial strategy and local responses. Is there any danger in moving existing activity around? That the industrial strategy is just going to be a big displacement game?
Well, if there is, I don't think the state's got any control over how it moves jobs around the country. So I don't think in reality it's something to be too concerned about. We've been trying to do this for many decades, and I think it's is it the 60th anniversary this year of the Brown ban, which banned large commercial developments in London and Birmingham with the very hope that it would just shift activity elsewhere in the country. And we know from the way that the country performs today that it wasn't particularly successful. And I think that's because it doesn't think about the incentives that companies face or what they're looking for in terms of why they locate where they do. You know, this is not an agnostic choice that I just happen to be here or happen to be there. They are largely, particularly the tradable part of the economy, is taking very specific decisions about where it decides to locate. I mean, there is an element of, you know, are we even sort of within urban areas, are we saying we're going to sort of implicitly move stuff out of London by trying to improve the performance of Manchester? My view is that if we look at other developed countries in the world, their second-tier cities of similar size do much better than what they currently do. So we're not actually getting as much out of these big places in the UK that we should be. This is not a zero-sum game if you've only got so much of the pie and shuffle it around. It's actually that the UK economy should be larger, and that should be because Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, Glasgow are larger than what they are currently. So I don't think it is a shuffling. I think traditionally the Treasury probably has seen it as a shuffling, and my big pushback is that I think I would view the world in a different way. So in that sense, we are even on that more sort of technical element of are we talking about moving stuff around? We shouldn't be. We should be talking about growing the size of the pie, and partly through making Glasgow a more attractive place to invest in.
I think I think that's a big shift in the language. So actually, I think relative to leveling up, there's just a much more explicit focus on growth now, and that will make them comfortable making announcements in London and the South East. We've already seen it. 2 runway announcements around Cambridge and Oxford. You know, I mean, they've just got this growth. They've got this growth first narrative that will allow them to. They'll have to do less on just sort of simply shuffling stuff around and more on really driving growth. Right, I'll let you wrap up because I can see the time.
Right. So questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. If you work in local government, you can join our online forum, which is on khub.net. You can then find us once you sign up for Knowledge Hub by searching for UK local economic growth in the UK. We also have a local growth plan page on our website. And as Paul said, that's useful for any economic strategies that local authorities or MCAs are doing. So if you're thinking of a refresh, do check that out. That brings together a lot of our other resources. It's at whatworksgrowth.org. If you haven't already signed up for a newsletter, that is at the bottom of every page on our website. And that's the best way to hear about future events and other resources. This recording is going to be on our YouTube page. We'll likely also embed it on our website if you want to rewatch it or you want to send it to colleagues who couldn't attend. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you at another event soon.